Long before the first kings carved their names into stone, before cities rose with towers and markets, there were rivers. They flowed silently through valleys, carrying silt, fish, and life itself. To the wandering hunters and gatherers, the valleys were not just landscapes, but promises of food, of water, of a place to stay. Here, along the banks of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, and the Yellow River, human history began to take a new shape. Villages sprouted where the soil was dark and rich, where each spring flood laid down a gift of fertility. People no longer followed herds or the seasons. Instead, they stayed, watching the waters rise and fall, planting seeds, harvesting grain, storing food for winters that no longer meant hunger. With permanence came memory. Families began to count the days, to mark the floods, to read the stars that governed the rains. The river valleys became not only homes, but teachers. They taught patience, for the river could be generous but also cruel. They taught cooperation, for canals and dikes could not be built by one family alone. They taught reverence, for the waters seemed to speak with the voice of gods. In time, the valleys became cradles of civilization. From them came the first bricks, the first laws, the first hymns sung to heaven. From them came the stories of creation, of kings chosen by the divine, of cities bound together by trade and faith. And from them came the fragility of greatness. For as the rivers could give, so too could they destroy. As you close your eyes tonight, let the murmur of these ancient rivers carry you. Imagine their endless flow, weaving through deserts and plains, carrying the memory of those who lived and dreamed upon their banks. The story of the valley civilization is not only about temples and kings, but about humanity's first attempt to root itself deeply in the earth and to find meaning in the eternal rhythm of water. The valley began as silence, only the rustle of reeds, the splash of fish breaking the surface, and the cry of distant birds gave sound to the landscape. It was a place where wild grasses grew taller than a man, where the river carved gentle paths through soil so dark it seemed to breathe. And into this silence came small bands of people, weary of wandering, drawn by the promise of water that never left. For countless generations before, humans had followed the rhythm of migration. They carried their homes on their backs, hunting deer and gazelle, gathering roots and berries, surviving at the mercy of chance. But here, at the edge of a river, something was different. The soil gave more than enough. Each handful planted yielded more than the hunters could carry. The people discovered that by cutting channels into the earth, they could guide the river's water, bending it toward the fields. For the first time, nature was not merely endured, it was gently shaped. The first settlers did not think of themselves as farmers, yet they became so. A few seeds of barley or wheat, cast into the ground, returned tenfold. Slowly, the wandering tents gave way to huts made of reeds and clay. Fires that once burned for a single night now smoldered for seasons. Families who had once scattered in search of food gathered together, united by a common hearth. Life along the river brought both abundance and uncertainty. The floods, so generous, could also destroy. A sudden rising of the waters swept away huts, tools, and dreams. Children grew up knowing that the river could one day feed them, and the next day take everything away. And so they learned to build stronger walls, to dig deeper canals, to work as one body. With permanence came new bonds. Marriage became more than a union of two. It was an alliance of families bound to the same land. The old songs of the hunt gave way to lullabies of planting and harvest. Elders began to tell children not only of spirits in the sky, but of the spirits of the river itself, gods that brought fertility, gods that demanded respect. The river valleys were also crossroads. Other bands of travelers, curious and cautious, arrived with stone tools, baskets, and stories of distant hills. Sometimes they traded obsidian for grain, shells for dried fish. Sometimes they clashed, for the fertile valley was too precious to share freely. From these encounters were born the first lessons in diplomacy and the first quarrels that would one day grow into wars. As the generations passed, the settlements grew. What began as a cluster of huts became a village, and the village became a town. Narrow paths were trodden smooth by feet carrying water jars, baskets of grain, and infants in woven slings. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, mingled with the scent of tilled earth. Dogs barked at strangers. Goats bleated in pens. Children laughed by the water's edge. But perhaps the greatest change was in the hearts of the settlers. They no longer measured their lives by the chase of animals or the ripening of berries. They measured them by the seasons of the river. Each family planted together, reaped together, mourned together when the waters rose too high, and rejoiced together when the harvest was plentiful. The valley taught them a lesson that still echoes in human history, that survival depends not only on strength, but on community. It is easy, as we drift towards sleep, to imagine those first nights in the valley, a small fire glowing in the dark, sparks rising like stars into the endless sky, a circle of families gathered around, sharing roasted grain and fish. Outside the firelight, the river murmurs, steady and eternal, promising both life and uncertainty. In that fragile balance, civilization had taken its first breath. The transformation from village to city was not sudden. It was slow, like the gradual widening of a river, impossible to notice from one day to the next, yet undeniable over centuries. What began as clusters of huts along the banks soon stretched outward, forming neighborhoods bound not just by kinship, but by necessity. The valley, once wilderness, had become a tapestry of human settlement. At first, the villages were simple. Reed houses lined the water's edge, smoke rising from hearths where flatbread baked on hot stones. Children fetched water in clay pots, and elders carved tools of stone and wood. But with each season, the surplus of grain grew. More food meant more people could survive. And with more people came new roles. Not everyone needed to farm. Some became potters, others weavers, others tool makers. a simple economy emerged, where goods were exchanged, not in silence, but in bustling markets that grew louder with every harvest. These markets were the heartbeat of early towns. A fisherman from the river might trade his catch for a pot of barley. A weaver would offer cloth dyed in bright colors, in return for goat's milk or obsidian blades. In these small acts of exchange, trust was built. Trust that tomorrow there would still be grain, still be cloth, still be something to trade. The rhythm of the valley began to sound not only in the rushing water, but in the voices of its people. As life grew more complex, so too did the structures of society. Villages needed leaders, not merely the elders of families, but figures who could settle disputes, organize labor, and call the people to action when the river threatened to flood. At first, these leaders were chosen for wisdom or strength, but soon, their authority became tied to something greater, the gods. The first temples rose, small shrines of mud brick and timber, where offerings of grain or beer were placed to appease unseen forces. The building of temples was no small act. It required labor beyond what one family could provide. It meant cooperation, dozens of hands shaping bricks, carrying stones, raising walls toward the sky. And once the temple stood, it became more than a house of gods. It was the heart of the settlement. Here, people gathered to celebrate, to mourn, to seek guidance. The temple square became the first true center of the city. With temples came writing. At first, simple marks on clay tablets, tallies of grain owed or given, names of families, records of floods. These early symbols were not stories, but they carried memory. They allowed the valley's people to plan beyond a single season, to organize work on a scale never before possible. Memory, once carried only in song and story, was now pressed into clay. Walls, too, began to rise. What had once been open villages became enclosed towns. The walls were not only for protection from raiders or wild beasts, they were symbols of belonging. Inside the walls was safety, identity, community. Outside was the unknown. As the walls grew thicker and the gates stronger, the people began to see themselves not as wanderers, nor even as villagers, but as citizens. And with citizenship came pride. Pride in the markets, pride in the temples, pride in the ability to shape the very flow of the river. Towns competed in size and beauty, each striving to outdo the next with larger walls, higher temples, more intricate crafts. What had begun as survival had transformed into ambition. Yet this ambition carried risks. Rivalries simmered. Families who once shared harvests began to argue over land and water. Leaders who claimed the favor of the gods sometimes demanded more grain, more labor, more obedience. Beneath the growing order of the cities, new tensions stirred. Still, the river valleys glowed with life. At dusk, the streets of the towns filled with sound, the bleating of goats, the chatter of merchants, the laughter of children chasing each other between stalls. Torches lit the temple steps, casting long shadows on mud brick walls. Beyond the city gates, Fields stretched wide and dark beneath the stars. As you imagine this scene, drifting deeper into rest, think of how extraordinary it was humanity's first towns, where strangers became neighbors, where trade became tradition, where clay tablets preserved the first lines of human memory. The leap from village to city was not only a change of scale, but a change of spirit. It was the moment when humanity stopped merely surviving and began to dream of permanence. The river was both master and servant. Each year, when its waters rose and spilled across the valley, the people watched with awe and dread. To some, the flood was a miracle. It spread dark silt across the fields, richer than any soil on earth. To others, it was a danger that could sweep away homes, animals, and lives in a single night. The flood was unpredictable. Yet without it, there would be no harvest, no bread, no life. In the early days, villagers gathered at the riverbank, studying the color of the water, the height of its flow, the flight of birds overhead. These were not idle observations, they were survival itself. To understand the moods of the river was to prepare for the seasons ahead. Over time, these observations became calendars, etched into memory and later into stone. Priests and elders proclaimed when to plant, when to harvest, when to pray for mercy. The soil left behind by the floods transformed the valley into a garden. Fields of barley and wheat stretched further each season, their golden stalks swaying like seas of grain. Palm trees and fruit orchards grew along the banks, their roots drinking from canals carved by patient hands. Irrigation channels snaked outward, carrying life-giving water to lands far from the river's edge. This was no longer mere subsistence, it was abundance. Abundance meant freedom. With full granaries, not everyone needed to toil in the fields. Some became builders, shaping mud bricks for temples and walls. Others became craftsmen, fashioning pottery, weaving textiles, carving ornaments of bone and shell. A society was blossoming, rooted in the gift of the floods. But abundance also demanded discipline. Granaries had to be guarded. Water channels required constant repair. Disputes over land and water grew more frequent, sometimes erupting into feuds that scarred entire families. To manage these tensions, leaders enforced rules first spoken, then recorded. Laws were born not from abstract ideas, but from the pressing need to keep the flood's gifts from tearing communities apart. The river, meanwhile, remained untamed. Some years it rose too high, drowning fields and huts alike. Other years, it failed to rise at all, leaving the soil dry and cracked, crops withering under the sun. Famine followed drought, reminding the people that they were never masters of the valley, only its caretakers. In such years, prayers and offerings multiplied, animals were sacrificed, hymns were sung, priests promised that the gods would restore balance. Whether or not the gods heard, the people endured, bound together by shared hope and shared suffering. Despite the risks, the river's bounty allowed for growth beyond imagination. Towns swelled into cities. Farmers exchanged grain for copper from distant hills. or lapis lazuli carried hundreds of miles from unknown lands. Boats sailed along the river's current, heavy with goods, their sails bright against the sun. The flood had become not only the engine of survival, but the pulse of commerce and culture. Stories grew from the floods, myths woven into the rhythm of life. In Mesopotamia, tales were told of great deluges sent by gods to cleanse the earth. Along the Nile, the river itself was worshipped as a divine being, a god whose yearly return was both feared and celebrated. These myths carried more than belief, they carried memory, teaching each generation that survival was inseparable from reverence. At night, families sat together outside their homes, telling stories of past floods of years when the waters rose gently and harvests filled every jar, and years when the waters raged, sweeping away even the strongest walls. Children listened wide-eyed, learning not only the past, but the fragile balance of their future. As you drift into sleep, imagine the sound of water lapping against the banks, steady and eternal. Imagine fields glistening in the sun after the floods receded, each seed planted in soil that seemed to glow with promise. The river gave life, but it demanded humility, and in that humility, humanity learned its first great truth, that survival rests not in conquest of nature, but in harmony with its gifts and its storms. The river did more than feed the body, it stirred the soul. To those who lived along its banks, its rising and falling seemed like the breath of a god. No human hand could command such power. The floods came when they willed, and no wall, no plea could halt their advance. In this mystery, people found not only fear, but reverence. The first shrines were simple, a few stones arranged in a circle, a reed hut with offerings of grain or beer left at its entrance. Yet these humble gestures carried deep meaning. They were acknowledgements that survival depended on forces unseen, on powers greater than any one family or village. Over time, the shrines grew taller, sturdier. Mud brick temples rose from the earth, their walls decorated with carvings of birds, fish, and flowing water. Inside, priests tended fires that never went out. They recited hymns, whispered prayers, and read omens in the patterns of smoke or the entrails of sacrificed animals. To the people, the priests were interpreters of the divine mediators between the restless river and those who lived by its mercy. Every flood, every drought, every harvest was understood through this sacred lens. The gods of the valley were many, and each bore the character of the river itself. There were gods of fertility, who blessed the fields with grain, gods of storms, who lashed the land with lightning and rain, gods of death, who waited in the depths, reminding all that life was fragile. Families passed these stories to their children, not as idle tales, but as truths embedded in daily life. Religious festivals became milestones in the year. At planting, processions wound through the streets, carrying baskets of seeds to the temples. At harvest, great feasts were held, with music, dancing, and offerings of the first fruits. These were not just rituals of gratitude, They were acts of survival. The people believed that only through collective reverence could they secure the gods' favor for another year. Temples were more than houses of worship. They became the centers of early learning. Priests recorded flood levels on clay tablets, kept accounts of grain stored in the temple's granaries, and observed the movements of stars that foretold the seasons. From this knowledge grew calendars, laws, and the first glimmers of science. Religion and reason were not yet separate. They were threads of the same cloth. Woven in the effort to understand the river's will, the architecture of the temples reflected ambition. Each generation built higher, seeking to reach closer to the sky. Towering ziggurats in Mesopotamia rose step by step like stairways for the gods. Along the Nile, temples aligned with the sun's journey, so that light pierced their chambers at precise moments of the year. These structures were not merely monuments, they were embodiments of faith, community, and identity. For those who lived in their shadow, the temples offered reassurance. When the floods destroyed fields, when disease crept through the streets, the sight of their high walls reminded people that order still existed, that the gods still watched. And when life was prosperous, the temples proclaimed pride, a visible testament to the unity of the city and its devotion. Yet faith was never free of doubt. Whispers spread when prayers went unanswered. When the river failed to rise or rose too high, some accused priests of angering the gods. Others questioned the gods themselves. These doubts were quiet, hidden behind walls. But they revealed an eternal truth that belief is as fragile as it is powerful. Still, night after night, fires burned within the temples. Drums echoed across the valleys. Families brought their offerings, bowed their heads, and trusted that their lives were part of a rhythm larger than themselves. In the endless cycle of floods and harvests, life and death, the people found meaning in the river's spirits. As you let your thoughts drift, imagine the glow of temple fires flickering against the night, the chants of priests rising like the river's own song. For those who lived in the valleys, faith was not a choice, but a necessity, a bridge across the uncertainty of existence. And on that bridge, civilization itself found stability, carried by belief as much as by water. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, another transformation unfolded, one carried not by the river's floods but by the hands of its merchants. The valley was no longer just a place to live, it became a place from which wealth could flow outward, reaching lands far beyond the horizon. Markets hummed with energy. Stalls lined narrow streets, filled with baskets of grain, jars of oil, bolts of woven cloth, and pots shaped with care. The air smelled of spices and smoke, of animals and fresh bread. Children darted between sellers, while traders called out their wares in voices that mingled with the cries of birds overhead. The city's rhythm, once set by the river, now pulsed through its markets. The river itself became a highway. Long boats with wooden hulls and billowing sails carried goods from one settlement to the next. Barges heavy with grain floated downstream, while lighter vessels carried pottery, fish, and reeds upstream. Trade routes stretched outward like veins, connecting distant valleys and distant peoples. To sail upon the river was to ride the lifeline of civilization itself. Merchants were more than carriers of goods, they were carriers of ideas. A potter from one city might learn a new technique from a stranger across the waters. A weaver could discover patterns and dyes brought from lands no villager had ever seen. In this way, culture traveled as surely as grain. The marketplace became a living library, where objects spoke of distant mountains, deserts, and seas. Wealth began to accumulate. Granaries overflowed, warehouses filled, and silver ornaments gleamed on the arms of those who prospered. Prosperity allowed cities to rise higher, temples to grow grander, walls to thicken, but it also created new divisions. Families who controlled trade gained influence and power, while those left behind began to labor not only for themselves but for others. In the shadow of prosperity lay inequality. Still, for most, the markets were places of wonder. On certain days of the month, festivals accompanied trade, with music and dancing spilling into the streets. Foreigners arrived bearing goods no one had seen before, copper from the hills, lapis lazuli glowing blue as the night sky, shells from distant coasts. Each exchange carried a sense of awe, a reminder that the world was larger than the valley, and that their lives were part of something vast and interconnected. Trade also demanded trust. A merchant who promised grain in exchange for wool needed assurance that both would keep their word. Out of this trust grew systems of weights, measures, and contracts. Clay tablets recorded debts and promises. Tokens represented goods yet to be delivered. What began as barter became the foundation of commerce and law. The river valleys themselves were transformed by trade. Cities rose along its banks like pearls on a string, each shining with its own character, yet bound together by the current. Where once there had been isolated villages, there was now a network, a civilization that thought of itself not only in terms of local fields, but in terms of connections, stretching outward in all directions. Yet prosperity, like the floods, carried its risks. Raiders were drawn to markets heavy with goods. Rival cities competed for control of trade routes. At times, boats meant for commerce carried warriors instead of grain. The same highways that spread wealth could also spread conflict. And so, behind the lively cries of merchants, shadows of rivalry began to stir. But at dusk, when the markets quieted and boats rested on the shore, there was still a sense of wonder. Fires glowed in the harbor, reflecting on the water's surface. Merchants sat by their goods, telling stories of journeys to faraway lands, their voices carrying into the night. Children listened wide-eyed, dreaming not of fields and floods, but of voyages, treasures, and worlds yet unseen. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine those markets by the river, alive with color and sound. Imagine the boats rocking gently in the current, laden with goods that carried both survival and dreams. The merchants of the valley were not only traders, they were builders of bridges of culture, of trust, of imagination across the waters of time. The valley, once a cradle of peace and abundance, could not remain untouched by conflict. Prosperity, after all, attracts not only traders, but also those who seek to take by force. As the markets swelled with grain and jewels, and the temples gleamed with offerings. Eyes from beyond the horizon turned toward the fertile lands. And so, the people of the river valleys learned another lesson: to preserve life. They would need walls, and behind those walls, warriors. At first, defenses were simple. A ditch carved around a settlement, sharpened stakes driven into the ground, watchmen posted at the gates. These measures offered comfort, but little true safety. Raiders could still break through. Fires could still consume reed huts, and treasures could still be stolen in the night. Families lived with the constant fear that abundance might vanish with the next raid. Over time, fear was shaped into stone. Walls of mud brick rose around the towns, thick and high enough to turn aside arrows and spears. Gates were reinforced with timber, guarded day and night. Towers allowed watchmen to scan the horizon for dust clouds, the sure sign of strangers approaching. Within these walls, people found a fragile sense of security, a belief that what they built could endure. Yet walls alone could not defend a city. Warriors became the lifeblood of protection. At first, they were simply farmers with spears, men who laid down plows in times of danger. But as threats grew, a new class emerged, those who fought not as a duty, but as their very way of life. They trained with bows, axes, and shields. They drilled in the art of formation, learning that unity was stronger than any single arm. The presence of warriors reshaped society. Leaders now commanded not only fields and temples, but armies. Songs once sung of floods and harvests now told of battles, of victories, of fallen kin whose names were carved into memory. Children grew up not only hearing stories of gods and merchants, but of heroes who defended the walls when all seemed lost. War changed the rhythm of the river valley. The same boats that once carried grain now carried soldiers. Canals that fed the fields also guided armies. Cities began to rival each other, each seeking to expand their control of land and trade. Alliances were forged in times of fear and broken in times of ambition. Conflict was no longer an occasional misfortune. It had become part of the valley's identity. Still, even in times of war, life endured. Behind the walls, markets continued, temples shone, and festivals filled the streets. But always, in the background, there lingered the awareness that safety was fragile. The higher the walls rose, the more they revealed the fear beneath them. The braver the warriors stood, the more they reminded all that peace was never guaranteed. There were nights when the valley trembled. Fires lit the horizon. Drums of war echoed in the distance. And families huddled inside their homes, whispering prayers to the gods of the river. And there were mornings when the city gates opened to victory warriors returning bloodied but triumphant, their shields scarred yet unbroken. Both moments etched themselves into the memory of the people, teaching them that civilization was built not only on abundance, but on sacrifice. As you close your eyes, imagine those walls rising from the earth, massive against the horizon, lit by torches at dusk. Imagine the watchmen on the towers, gazing out across the endless plain, listening for the distant thunder of hooves. Within the walls, life continued fragile. precious, determined. For the people of the valley had learned that to hold on to their dreams, they must guard them, and in the shadow of the walls, warriors kept their eternal watch. There comes a moment in every civilization when its rhythm finds harmony, when fear of hunger fades, when walls stand firm, and when abundance spills into every corner of life. For the valley civilizations, this was the golden age, when their people turned from survival to creation, from necessity to beauty. The markets grew more vibrant than ever. Grain was plentiful, pottery elegant, textiles rich with color. Traders from distant lands brought copper, tin, and exotic stones, which local artisans shaped into tools, ornaments, and symbols of pride. The hum of commerce was matched by the hum of art, as hands that once struggled against the soil now found leisure to carve, paint, and compose. Temples rose higher, their walls adorned with intricate reliefs, scenes of harvests, processions, and celestial beings stretched across clay and stone. Within the sanctuaries, priests recorded not just floods and offerings, but hymns and myths. The earliest written stories began to take form, pressed into tablets, tales of creation, of gods who shaped the earth, of heroes who crossed the river between life and death. These stories were more than entertainment. They were threads binding a people to their past and their destiny. Law also matured in this era. What began as custom became code. Leaders proclaimed decrees carved into stone or clay, visible for all to see. Theft, debt, disputes over land all found resolution, not through feud, but through rules agreed upon by the community. Justice, once the will of the strong, became a shared foundation. These laws gave order to abundance, ensuring that the valley's gifts did not unravel in envy or strife. Education flourished. In temple schools, scribes trained to master the difficult art of writing. They learned to keep accounts, draft contracts, and preserve the words of kings. Knowledge that once lived only in memory now endured beyond a single lifetime. The valley became not just a home of crops and markets, but a home of ideas. Art reached beyond temples and into daily life. Pottery was painted with patterns of waves and birds. Textiles embroidered with symbols of fertility. Jewelry crafted to glimmer in the sun. Music filled the air flutes carved from reeds. Drums made of stretched hide. Voices lifted in songs that blended work with joy. The valley was alive not only with labor, but with celebration. The Golden Age was also an age of confidence. Leaders looked beyond survival and began to dream of legacy. Cities competed not merely in trade, but in grander, larger temples, broader streets, higher walls. Festivals grew more elaborate, lasting days, with parades of dancers, musicians, and offerings that dazzled the crowds. In these moments, the people felt invincible, as if the river itself had chosen them for greatness. But the seeds of fragility were still present. Prosperity made the cities tempting targets, not only for raiders but for rival kingdoms. Wealth also deepened divides. Some families lived in houses of brick with storerooms full of grain, while others toiled endlessly for a share of the harvest. Yet for a time, these tensions were overshadowed by the glow of achievement. At dusk, the cities of the valley shone like jewels. Torches lined the streets. Music drifted from courtyards, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. From the river, travelers approaching by boat would see towers and temples rising above the walls, glowing against the setting sun. To them, it must have seemed as if the city were eternal, rooted as firmly as the river itself. As you let your thoughts wander, imagine standing on those walls at twilight, watching the city below. Children laugh in the markets, scribes etch words into clay, and musicians play their songs beneath the stars. It was an age when humanity believed it had mastered the balance between earth, water, and spirit. In that fragile, radiant balance, civilization reached its first great flowering, a golden moment, destined to echo across time. No city, however grand, could exist in isolation. The rivers that nourished the valleys also linked them to worlds beyond. And soon the people discovered that their destiny was tied not only to their own soil, but to the vast web of empires stretching across mountains, deserts, and seas. Merchants were the first ambassadors. Their boats carried not only grain and cloth, but stories. From the north came traders with timber and furs. From the south, caravans bearing ivory and spices. Across deserts, camels trudged with copper and tin across seas. Ships brought shells and gems. Each exchange wove a thread into a fabric of connection that reached far beyond the valley's horizon. With trade came ideas. New tools appeared, bronze weapons forged from metals that did not exist in the valley itself. Plows that cut deeper into the soil. Wheels that carried goods faster than any man could walk. Foreign gods were whispered into local myths, their names mingling with the river spirits, their symbols carved beside those of native deities. Cultures touched, blended, and reshaped each other in subtle ways. Diplomacy followed, commerce, envoys traveled between cities, carrying gifts and words of peace. Alliances were formed, sealed by marriage between ruling families. Pacts promised shared defense against raiders, or mutual access to trade routes. But these bonds were fragile, tested whenever ambition outweighed trust. Treaties carved in stone could be broken as swiftly as clay shattered in a fire. Conflict was as inevitable as exchange. Rival cities sought to control trade, to monopolize river crossings, to dominate fertile fields. Armies marched across plains, their banners bright against the horizon. Walls rose higher, towers bristled with defenders. And the valley learned that wealth invited both admiration and envy. The same roads that carried goods carried warriors, and the same rivers that spread prosperity carried fleets of war. Yet even in rivalry, there was growth. War demanded organization, generals, supplies, communication. Victories brought not only territory but knowledge. As conquered peoples introduced new crafts, new scripts, new customs, defeat, too, carried lessons, reminding the valley that survival lay in adaptation as much as in strength. The web of empires stretched ever wider. To the west, people along distant coasts built ships that braved the open sea. To the east, mountains concealed kingdoms whose jewels dazzled merchants. To the north and south, deserts guarded routes that only the bravest could cross. The valley was no longer the whole world. It was a node in a great network, a beating heart in the growing body of human civilization. Within the cities, the evidence of these connections was visible. Foreign spices scented the markets. Exotic stones gleamed in jewelry, and distant words crept into daily speech. Temples displayed gifts from other lands, claiming that the gods themselves welcomed these offerings. Children grew up knowing that beyond their walls lay vast worlds, strange and wondrous, yet bound to their own lives by invisible threads. But connections also brought vulnerability. Diseases traveled with caravans, spreading through cities unprepared for their touch. Drought in one region disrupted trade in another. The fall of a distant ally could send ripples that reached even the most secure city. The web was strong, but also delicate, its threads both lifeline and trap. Still, for the people of the valley, these were days of discovery. To sit in the marketplace and hear stories of mountains taller than clouds, seas without end, or deserts where stars guided travelers, was to glimpse infinity. The world was no longer a closed circle of river and field. It was boundless, inviting imagination as much as ambition. As you drift into calm, imagine yourself aboard a riverboat at twilight, sails catching the evening breeze. Laden with goods from faraway lands, the city glows on the horizon, its walls rising above the water, its temples lit by torchlight. Behind you lies the memory of distant mountains. Ahead, the promise of home. In that moment, the valley civilization was more than a place. It was a bridge, connecting countless peoples across the tapestry of time. Every golden age carries within it the seeds of its end. For the valley civilizations, decline did not strike in a single moment of catastrophe, but crept like a slow shadow across generations. What once seemed eternal, the floods, the markets, the temples began to falter, revealing how fragile even the strongest walls could be. The first signs were written in the earth itself. Some years the river failed to rise high enough, leaving fields dry and cracked. Crops withered beneath the sun, granaries emptied, and famine spread through the land. Other years, the river swelled too violently, drowning fields and villages alike. Farmers whispered that the gods had turned away, and priests struggled to explain why their prayers went unanswered. Climate, once the valley's faithful ally, had become unpredictable. As food grew scarce, tensions flared. Families once bound in unity quarreled over water and land. Wealthy merchants and rulers, their storehouses still full, demanded loyalty from those who starved. Inequality, hidden during times of abundance, now lay bare. Riots shook the markets. Old alliances fractured. Trust, once the lifeblood of the cities, drained away like water through a broken canal. Beyond the valley's borders, new powers stirred. Nomadic tribes, once dismissed as wanderers, grew bold as they watched the cities weaken. They swept into fertile lands, raiding villages and testing the strength of city walls. Armies, once invincible, found themselves stretched thin, fighting not only foreign invaders but their own citizens in revolt. The river that once served as a highway of trade now carried fleets of war. Inside the cities, cracks spread through the foundations of faith. Temples, once glowing with offerings, now stood half empty. Priests, unable to restore balance to the floods, lost their aura of certainty. Some turned to new gods, others abandoned old rituals. Without the glue of shared belief, the people drifted apart, each searching for answers in the gathering dark. Writing, once a tool of memory, became a witness to collapse. Clay tablets recorded not abundance, but shortages. Contracts spoke not of new trade, but of debts unpaid. Songs turned mournful, recalling not the victories of warriors or the gifts of the river, but the hunger of children and the silence of gods. Even the great walls that once promised safety grew useless. They could not stop drought, nor hold back famine. They could not keep disease from spreading through crowded streets. They could not prevent betrayal from within, as rival leaders struggled for power, turning cities into battlegrounds of ambition. Yet amid the decline, life did not vanish at once. Children still played along the riverbanks, though their laughter was tinged with hunger. Merchants still traded, though their goods were fewer and their journeys more dangerous. Families still gathered at night, telling stories of the past, of times when the river was faithful and the gods were kind. In their voices lingered a quiet resilience, a determination to endure even as the world shifted beneath their feet. For centuries, the shadows deepened. Some cities crumbled into ruins, their walls swallowed by sand, their temples toppled by time. Others survived by bending, adapting, finding new ways to live with less. Yet none escaped the truth that no civilization, no matter how radiant, could remain untouched by change. As you close your eyes, imagine walking through the remnants of a once great city. The streets are silent, the markets empty, the walls cracked and crumbling. Yet in the air, you can almost hear echoes: the laughter of children, the songs of priests, the hum of merchants, as if the city itself still remembers. The shadows of decline remind us not only of loss, but of impermanence, that every rise carries a fall, and every fall leaves behind whispers of what once was. When the walls had crumbled, when the markets had fallen silent, and when the river no longer answered with its old rhythm, what remained of the valley civilizations? At first glance, little more than dust and ruins. Yet beneath the surface, in fragments of stone and shards of clay, their voices continued to speak. Archaeologists in later ages would kneel in the dirt, brushing sand from broken tablets. The symbols pressed into clay still told their stories: accounts of harvests, lists of offerings, laws carved in the name of kings long forgotten. From these fragile records, the shape of vanished lives emerged. The valley people had not disappeared entirely. They had left memory behind. etched into earth itself. The ruins of temples, too, whispered of their grandeur. Even toppled columns revealed the ambition of builders who dreamed of reaching the heavens. Carvings of gods, half erased by time, showed the devotion of a people who once believed the river's voice was divine. Broken statues, scattered across fields of dust, still carried dignity, reminders that humanity had always sought meaning beyond survival. But the legacy of the valleys was not just in stone or clay. It lived in ideas carried forward by those who came after. The concept of law, born from the need to manage floods and fields, echoed in later codes of justice. The art of writing, first tallying grain and offerings, became the foundation of literature and history. The rituals of the river evolved into the religions of empires yet unborn. Even decline could not erase these gifts. They were seeds carried on the wind, taking root in distant lands. The valley civilizations also left warnings. They showed that abundance can lead to complacency, that prosperity can mask inequality, and that nature's balance is never guaranteed. They taught that no wall is strong enough to hold back drought, no temple high enough to guarantee divine favor. Their fall was not only a tragedy, but a lesson, a reminder of the fragile pact between humanity and the world it inhabits. For those who walk among the ruins today, there is a strange silence, the laughter of children, the chants of priests, the hum of markets, all are gone. Yet the silence is not empty. It is filled with echoes, waiting for ears willing to listen. Each broken brick, each faded symbol, is a whisper across time. We were here, we lived, we dreamed. And perhaps this is the truest legacy of the valley civilizations, not their walls or their wealth, but their humanity. They were the first to root themselves deeply in the soil, to wrest order from chaos, to seek permanence in a world of change. They stumbled, they rose, they fell. But in doing so, they began the story of civilization itself, a story that continues wherever rivers flow and people dream of tomorrow. As you drift into the quiet of night, imagine standing in a valley at dusk. The river glimmers faintly in the fading light, winding between ruins softened by centuries. The air is still, the world hushed. Yet you can almost feel the pulse of those who once walked here. Their time has passed, but their essence endures in us, in the cities we build, in the questions we ask, and in the dreams we chase. For though dust may cover their stones, the spirit of the valley, civilizations, lives on, eternal as the rivers that once gave them life. The story of the valley civilizations does not end with their ruins. Though their cities crumbled and their temples fell silent, the rivers that once nurtured them still flow. They carry, in their endless currents, the memory of those who first settled by their banks, who planted seeds in dark soil, who built walls to protect their dreams, and who carved prayers into stone. Stand beside the Nile, and you will see its waters shimmer as they did 5,000 years ago. Drift along the Tigris or Euphrates, and the same currents that fed the world's first fields still ripple beneath the sun. Walk the banks of the Indus or the Yellow River, and though the languages have changed, though the gods have shifted, the rhythm of life remains. Fields still stretch toward the horizon. Boats still ride the current. Children still laugh by the shore. The rivers do not forget. For us, their legacy is not only in the fragments of pottery or the marks on clay tablets, it is in the very fabric of how we live. Every city built today carries the echo of those first towns of mud brick. Every law we follow has its roots in the codes carved by rulers who sought order among floods and famine. Every story told, every prayer whispered, owes something to the myths sung in the temples of the valleys. The rivers remind us of a truth older than history, that civilizations are fragile, but humanity endures. Empires may rise and fall, but the dream of permanence, of community, of meaning, flows on like water. It is passed from one generation to the next, changing form, yet never ceasing. And so, as you let your thoughts settle into quiet, imagine yourself lying beside one of those ancient rivers. The night air is cool. The stars are reflected in the slow-moving current, and the murmur of water lulls you towards sleep. Around you, the ruins of temples and cities rest in silence, but the river whispers softly, carrying their memory. We were here, we lived, we dreamed, and so will you. The cradle of the valleys was not only the beginning of civilization, it was the beginning of us all. Their story is our story. Their rivers, our rivers. Their lessons, our lessons. For the rivers never forget, and as long as they flow, neither will we.